Bible.
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Are you either watching or listening today a non-Catholic? Well, that's fantastic. We have a lot of non-Catholic viewers and listeners to EWTN each and every day, so you're in good company. I'll bet you've got a question or two about the Catholic faith, and you'd love to get that question answered. This is a program for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. If you're watching us on TV today, you can participate as well by shooting us an email. Here's the address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer, Matt Gabinski our phone screener, Jeff Burson handles social media for us. We're also streaming right now on Facebook Live and YouTube. So if you want to ask a question on one of those platforms, you can certainly do that. Put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio, and hopefully we can get it on today's program. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing great. How are you, my friend?
You know, I'm decent. Thank you.
Interesting question here from John via email. Dr. Anders, I understand that prayer to Mary and the other so-called capital S saints are an important part of the spiritual life for most Catholics. What I don't understand is, given its purported efficacy, why don't we read about anybody in the New Testament praying to anyone but God? It would seem to be a glaring omission.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the New Testament, well, let me actually give you the context of the entire Bible. I do think we find devotion to the saints and a doctrine of that efficacy in the context of the entire Bible. If you go back into the Old Testament, clearly God himself indicates that the prayers of some people are more efficacious for intercession than others. When Abraham challenges God in Genesis 18 about the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, well, for the sake of the 10 righteous, I will spare all of the wicked, right? When Moses intercedes for the people of Israel, God says, I'm going to wipe them out because of this golden calf business. And Moses says, no, don't do that. Then the Egyptians will say that you couldn't rescue your people and remember the promises to the patriarchs. And God says, okay. Because you asked, Moses, I won't wipe out Israel. In the book of Job, when the companions of Job have been giving him poor advice, and God appears at the end of the book, he says to the companions of Job, I'm not happy with you guys, but if you ask my servant Job to pray for you, I will hear his prayers on your behalf. This is a specific instruction from God that he will hear someone else's prayers, but not yours, but someone else can pray on your behalf. Now, does that kind of relationship pertain after death? Well, 2 Kings chapter 13, we find evidence for the efficacy of the veneration of relics, which is deeply connected to the cult of saints. When the bones of the prophet Elisha are efficacious for miracles in the life of the faithful. In the book of 2 Maccabees chapter 15, we learn that the prophet Jeremiah, and as well as a former high priest in Jerusalem, are both efficacious intercessors for the people of God, the people of Judea who are going into battle. The book of Tobit, chapter 15, chapter 12, indicates that Raphael, the archangel, had the job of interceding on behalf of Tobias and Sarah and offering their prayers to God. Book of Revelation, chapter 5, verse 8, seems to be an allusion to Tobit, and it assigns that job to the holy saints, offering our prayers before the throne of God. And of course, the apostles themselves were powerful intercessors, even third-class relics, handkerchiefs and whatnot that touched the bodies of the apostles. Peter's shadow even would fall on people and they would be healed according to the book of Acts. So I really do think there's plentiful evidence of this kind of dynamic in the texts of the New Testament. And of course, immediately after the canon was composed, actually contemporaneous with the compilation of the canon, we have these extra biblical accounts like the martyrdom of Polycarp that show powerful devotion to the saints and their relics from a very, very early age within church history. And archaeologically, you actually can track the progress of Christianity in the ancient world by tracking the archaeological progress of shrines to the martyrs and to the saints. In fact, Christianity and devotion to the saints is coextensive in late antiquity. You can't find the one without the other, which is why St. Jerome could write in his letter against Vigilantius that the Bishop of Rome does not do wrong when he offers the holy sacrifice of the Mass over the bones of Peter and Paul, and not the Bishop of Rome only, Jerome says, but all the bishops throughout the world.
All right. And John, thanks so much for your email. Dylan checked in on YouTube and says, why is the Catholic Church so focused on worldly items such as art or cathedrals? We're not supposed to be materialistic. All the Catholic buildings are worth trillions.
Yeah, okay. Couple pieces of misinformation there right now. I don't think there is a single Catholic piece of architecture that's worth trillions, right? And certainly not. Most of them are not worth a lot of money. I mean, you ought to come. I mean, my very fond of my parish. It's done a lot of good for me, but glorious architecture not going to go down.
Not so much.
Not going to go down in the annals of architectural history or Architectural Digest, right? And so the vast majority of Catholic property, if you will, over the world is very functional, and most of it at the service of the poor. I mean, that's if you just sort of did a survey of Catholic parishes around the world, I think that's what you would find. There are a few extraordinary Catholic pieces of architecture, medieval cathedrals and whatnot, that are quite valuable and relics of beauty and style, that were the products of whole civilizations that decided to pour their love and their time and their energy and their talent into something to bring glory to God. And thank God that they did. I mean, I have had the privilege of visiting some of those medieval cathedrals in Europe, and they evoke transcendence and a sense of the divine and wonder and an age of faith that is quite edifying.
And they're open to everybody.
Exactly. They
rich
belong,
and poor alike.
They belong to really to the world, and not the private property of the Catholic Church, such that it's held only and reserved for a few Catholic elites. And the same thing would be true even of magnificent collections of art and architecture like you might find in the museums of the Vatican. These are curated for the sake of the common good and the public. I mean, if you were to dispossess the Church of these things, they would just end up in private collections of people whose companies are worth trillions.
Yeah, there you go. Dylan, thanks so much for your question. In a moment, we're going to talk with Tom in Twinsburg, Ohio, also John in Houston, Vanessa in North Carolina. Look at this, couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Stay with us.
Coming at you now is another quote from Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar. I think Jesus would be most pleased if he could find people who say, Jesus, I'm not asking for anything. If I have punishment due to me, I'll take whatever you give me. I just want to love you now. I just want to love you for yourself. Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar is available at EWTNRC.com. That's EWTNRC.com. Or call 1-800-854-6316.
We live in a world of extreme polarization, often consumed by anger and anxiety, a climate that is dividing our country and our world, a division so wide there is even confusion within our church. And today, most secular news sources only serve to deepen this divide. But at Catholic News Agency, our mission is to be a witness to the truth of our Catholic faith, providing trustworthy, relevant, and timely news affecting the global church, as well as in-depth coverage of the Pope, the Vatican, the Church in the U.S., and the ongoing battle for the culture of life. Every day, CNA's reporters and editors maintain a continuous, faithful watch on the people and the events that impact lives and the souls of Catholics, delivering more news from a Catholic perspective than anyone else. Catholic News Agency, a service of EWTN News. Trusted, timely, Catholic. Engage at CatholicNewsAgency.com.
It's called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Tom in Twinsburg, Ohio, listening on AM 1260, The Rock. Hey there, Tom. What's on your mind today, sir?
The screeners that I had two good questions, but the screeners that I could only ask one a month. So the one I picked was, how did Jesus grow in knowledge and wisdom if he's God?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. The Catholic doctrine on Christ is that Christ has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, and the human nature is fully human. Everything about a human nature that would be ascribable to a human is true of Jesus' human nature. So, for example, the human nature of Christ has a rational soul. Human nature of Christ has biological and cognitive development, because that's what humans do, right? You would not be essentially human if your brain didn't develop, if your neurology didn't develop. Mm-hmm. And so Christ as a human was perfectly capable of acquiring knowledge through empirical experience and participation. So, to take an example, the human fingers of Jesus, presumably at birth, did not automatically have the ability to play Rachmaninoff on the piano, right? Now, as God, he could have miraculously infused them with such a power, right? But they did not, insofar as they were human hands, automatically have the power to play Rachmaninoff on the piano. But if baby Jesus had sat down, with a prim and proper piano teacher that had schooled him, he could have acquired the proper motor memory and musical knowledge to play Rachmaninoff. And meanwhile, in his divine nature, he'd be like, let me tell you a thing or two about Rachmaninoff. I know that guy.
Of course, they'd also have to invent the piano first.
Well, hey, nothing's impossible for God.
You got it. Thanks so much for your call, Tom. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Let's go to John now in Houston, listening on the Great Guadalupe Radio. Hello, John. What's on your mind today?
Hello there. Thanks for taking the call. Dr. Anders, I got to join you in February back in Alexandria, Louisiana. I sat behind you, so I have met you, and that was such a treat.
Oh, wonderful.
So I had a couple over the weekend. One is a failed Catholic who converted to marry his first wife. The female is Anglican Catholic, but the two of them are now Episcopalian. And she insists they have apostolic succession. I could only say I'm almost certain you do not. However, I could not prove to her they do not have apostolic succession.
Sure.
What's your take on that?
Sure. Yeah. Of course, that's what she says. And that is the Anglican position. The Anglican position is that they have valid apostolic succession. So here are some considerations. It is the infallible teaching of the Catholic magisterium that Anglican orders are null and void. And that was the judgment of Pope Leo XIII in his document Apostolicae Curiae, and the opinion of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is that ruling is infallibly taught, right? So they do not have valid orders. Now, it's also been the practice of the Catholic Church since the time of Cardinal Pole that if Anglican priests convert to Roman Catholicism and present themselves for ministry, they are absolutely ordained to the Catholic faith, as opposed to being conditionally ordained. So if you have a doubt about the validity of someone's ordination, then you can give them what's called a conditional ordination. If this person is not validly ordained, then I ordain you.
Okay.
Same thing like with a conditional baptism. That's always been the practice ever since the time of Cardinal Pole, ever since the Edwardine ordinal was introduced into Anglican orders, into the Anglican ordination rite. The position of the Catholic Church has been these people have vitiated their sacramental orders and have to be absolutely ordained. Interestingly, the Orthodox Church also rejects the validity of Anglican orders, and if Anglican priests present themselves to any Orthodox communion, suggesting they want to be accepted into ministry, they'll be absolutely ordained in that communion as well. Now, I only point that out. Orthodoxy really doesn't determine anything for Catholic faith, but much of the Anglican apology for their own ecclesiology, the defense of their view of the Church, many Anglicans hold to what's called the branch theory. And this is their theory. They hold that there's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, preserving the sacraments through apostolic succession, but that one church has three branches: the Anglican branch, the Catholic branch, and the Orthodox branch. Now, if that were true, it would be very strange that two of the three branches don't recognize the branch theory. Which shows right off the bat that the theory itself is not Catholic with either a big C or a small c. It's not universally held.
Right.
So to me, it's a bit strange credibility to the breaking point that they could assert, as Catholic dogma, Catholic in the broadest sense of the term, something that their own theory would seem to require the other so-called branches to hold, which they don't, right? So it's, all that is a consideration. Now, why does the Catholic Church regard Anglican orders as null and void? Well, it's not because they left the Catholic fold, because there are schismatic groups that maintain valid apostolic succession. It's because they vitiated their sacrament of orders. When Henry left the church, Henry VIII, he actually retained a Catholic view of the sacraments and of the priesthood. And so they were in schism, they were in disobedience to the Pope, but they didn't stop being valid priests and bishops in consequence. But under King Edward was strongly influenced by Puritan forces in his own court that imported Cranmer and Calvinist theology into the Anglican rite of ordination. And of course, the Calvinist doctrine on the priesthood actually rejects the doctrine of apostolic succession as it's been articulated classically, as well as the doctrine of the sacrificial priesthood. So it's kind of hard to hold apostolic succession, in an ordained priesthood when you vitiate the doctrine of priesthood.
Sure. John, is that helpful for you?
I love it. I wish I could do it. But thank you, Dr. Anders. You answered it, and I knew you could.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. And if you prefer, you can also refer your friend to the EWTN podcast of this program. You can get that by going to EWTNradio.net. EWTNradio.net. We'll have that posted for you in a couple hours from right now. Let's go now to Modesto in Miami, listening on YouTube today. Hello, Modesto. What's on your mind today?
Hi. The early church with the apostles, when they reference the pagan gods and goddesses as they're evangelizing and represented, I guess, in statues too, they say behind them, attached behind all of them is demons, and it's really a demon behind that representation. So I know that they destroyed them gradually, but in the Renaissance period, the popes brought back at least the statues, and in admiration because of reviving the classics, and they displayed them in the Vatican, and to this day some of these statues are still preserved. Are they still, however, those same statues, Bacchus, Apollo, Aphrodite, are they still attached behind? Is there still a demonic attachment behind them, and is that sinful? And is that still sinful? Should they still be preserved?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, let me clarify a little bit the nature of the apostolic teaching on pagan idolatry, idols, the worship thereof, and how that entered into the Catholic theological tradition. You actually do find among some of the early apologists, not the apostles, but some of the early apologists of the Catholic tradition, a theory that miracles attributed to pagan statues and the worship of pagan statues are actually accomplished by demons. Now, that theory presumes that such miracles actually occurred, right? So I think the apologist was taking at face value pagan reports, pagan accounts of miraculous answers to prayer and so forth. And then they're saying, well, if that's the case, what's the explanation? I don't think we are today compelled by that to hold that behind every pagan statue there was lurking a malevolent demon trying to manipulate the worshipers. I mean, perhaps there was, but that's not a Catholic dogma to hold that position. One doesn't have to think that. You could come up with other explanations. And one of them might be the pagans didn't actually have miracles, that that's just legendary. That'd be another way of handling this. I'd be more inclined to that myself. Now, there's something a little bit on point in the teaching of St. Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians, when Paul addresses the question of whether or not Christians can eat meat that has been sacrificed to an idol. And what he says is that the worship that pagans offer to their gods is in fact offered to a demon, right? That's not the same thing as saying that there's a demon lurking behind every statue, but it is to say that pagan idolatry involves one with the worship of demons and should be avoided by Christians. Now, here's the really interesting thing. He says, well, is eating meat sacrificed to a pagan god does that implicate you in the worship of demons? And the fascinating thing that Paul contends is he says, no, it doesn't, because the idol itself is nothing. The idol itself is nothing. And so one should not avoid meat simply because it had been offered in sacrifice to a demon, unless if by eating the meat you lead your neighbor to think that you approve of idolatry. See, in the ancient world, if you went into the meat market and you said, I'd like a quarter pound of ground beef, whatever you got back had been offered to a pagan god. Like you couldn't slaughter an animal without it being a pagan sacrifice.
I see.
I mean, anything you ate was going to have been offered. So the question was, do Christians have to become vegetarians in the first century? And Paul said, no, they don't, because the idol itself is nothing. However, if eating the meat causes your neighbor to stumble and to approve idolatry, then you should avoid the meat. All right, so that's the context. So applying that to your own question, here's how I would see it. In the era of the Church Fathers and the first 3 centuries of the Church, when idolatry was a major preoccupation and a major challenge to Christian identity, and people were tempted to go back and offer sacrifice to maybe the genius of the Roman emperor or to some other pagan deity, or to sort of split the difference between Jesus and some pagan deity, the Church had every reason in the world to oppose even the existence of these statues, because they were a stumbling block to the weak. In the Renaissance period, there really weren't Christians that were actively worshiping or tempted to worship Zeus or Apollo or Jupiter or any of these characters. And so since Paul and reason tell us that the statue itself is just a block of marble, would be no theological objection to maintaining it for historical and cultural and artistic interest.
All right. Modesto, thanks so much for your question. Glad to hear from you in Miami. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Paul, listening in Seattle today on Sacred Heart Radio. Hey there, Paul. What's on your mind today?
Well, I had a quick question about when Christ was teaching on prayer. He told us that we should not use vain repetition. And in our Catholic prayers, there's so much repetition of our phrases. And I was just wondering, what did Christ mean by don't use vain repetition?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, when you pray, you mustn't be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand in the synagogue and pray at street corners, that they may be seen by men. And in praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. So in both of these admonitions about prayer, what is in view is, what is the disposition of one's heart? Are you praying out of vanity to be seen by men? Are you praying because you think that prayer is a form of magic, and that by heaping up empty phrases or by reciting, say, a litany of the names of the pagan gods, and this was a practice. There's a zillion pagan gods. You name them all in the hopes that one will hear you. As if prayer were kind of like a magic spell that you would use to coerce the unseen world to do your will. And Jesus says that actually Christian prayer is completely unlike that. In fact, we don't even pray to let God know what we want. The purpose of prayer is not to inform God. Now, St. Augustine of Hippo, in his letter to the widow Proba on Christian prayer, discusses this at length. And he says the real point of Christian prayer, in particular the Our Father, is not to tell God what we need or to bend his will to ours. It's to bring our will in conformity with his. And you'll notice that the petitions of the Lord's Prayer, we're not asking for new Ferraris in the Lord's Prayer. We're asking that God's will be done, that we have the grace to forgive our enemies, that we have our daily bread, which could be understood either as sufficient sustenance for this day, may I be satisfied with only my daily bread, or even with the Eucharistic offering that we would consume daily, and then to be led not into temptation, but delivered from evil. This is the purpose of Christian prayer, to change our affections, to change what we want, right, rather than to tell God what we want, rather to make our wants like his. Now, Christ never says that repetition in prayer is wrong. He never says that at all. In fact, he commands it. when the disciples say, "Teach us how to pray," Jesus doesn't say, "Well, pray spontaneously from the heart." He doesn't say that. He says, "Here's a formulaic prayer I'd like you to repeat, presumably daily."
Yeah.
He gives us repetitive prayer as the form of prayer, but repetitive prayer aimed at changing our affections. The Psalms, which have always been the church's primary prayer text, are ridiculously repetitive. In particular, Psalm 136. I mean, you've what is these various canticles that you read? Blessed be God in all the dolphins and the water creatures and the sea squirts and the centipedes and the
Buicks. Sure.
It's just this incredible litany of things in which God is blessed. Very repetitive psalm.
Yeah. So the key word here is stay away from the vain repetition.
Right.
All right, very good. There you go, Paul. Thanks so much for your call today. In a moment, we'll talk with Barbara in Louisiana. We do have a couple of lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck. This is an EWTN bookmark brief. Speaking of good friend Deacon Harold Burke Sivers, author of Our Life of Service, the Handbook for Catholic Deacons, published by Ave Maria Press, available naturally through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Tell us, what is this book about, and is it just for deacons?
No, it's not just for deacons. It's for anyone that wants to learn more about the life of the deacon, how the deacon ministers in the life of the church. The book is about the third kind of level or tier of diaconal service. So there's teaching, sanctifying, and leading, which is also called charity. It's the service ministry of the deacon. How does the deacon serve his family? And then how does that inform how he serves in the life of the church, both inside and outside the parish?
Okay, very good. The book, Our Life of Service, the Handbook for Catholic Deacons, written by our great friend, Deacon Harold Burke Sivers. And I'm Doug Keck. This has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief. Thanks for stopping by.
Call to Communion is on YouTube. Search YouTube to find the EWTN YouTube channel, so you'll never miss an episode of our show or any of your favorite EWTN radio shows.
Each week on The World Over, Raymond Arroyo challenges listeners and viewers with important political and cultural reporting and analysis of a wide variety of topics of interest to Catholics and people of faith. And you can get news from the world over in your inbox every week. It's easy. Visit EWTN.com and click subscribe. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Let us hear your thoughts on some of the top news stories.
Tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
On most of these EWTN stations.
Now back to Call to Communion.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. A couple of lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're watching us on TV today, you can shoot us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. Before we go back to the phones, big congratulations from us to a long-time EWTN radio family member celebrating their 12th anniversary with us this week. It is Red Sea Radio. They have 3 radio stations in Texas serving Bryan College Station, Waco, Palestine. Our big thanks to Dennis and his great team there at Red Sea Radio. Fantastic. 12th anniversary. All right, back to the phones right now. Here is Barbara in Louisiana. Barbara, what's on your mind today?
Well, I serve in the RCIA ministry, so I always try to prepare myself for questions that could come up for people coming into the church. Mm-hmm. And I noticed several times people have brought up about the Filioque clause in the creed, and this sounds contentious, but it's not meant to be. What difference does it make if the Father and the Son, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, or just from the Father? I can't quite get my head around why is that a big issue.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So there are theological implications of this doctrine that are important, and I don't want to belittle them. But that's not why the issue became so divisive between East and West, right? The reason it became so divisive between East and West is this became a kind of shibboleth, a sort of test case, a litmus test for the authority of the Pope. And when there was a patriarch of Constantinople named Photius who wanted grounds to dispute papal jurisdiction, papal primacy. So he started kicking around for things that Latin priests did that Eastern priests did not do, and he found a few of them. One of them is, well, the Latins, they use unleavened bread for consecration. They shave. He was down on shaven priests. And they confess the Filioque, which we don't, right? So you really get the sense of a fellow who was itching for a justification, right? And so I think that the animus surrounding the question is, this is my personal judgment. You're free to disagree with me. It has less to do with the kind of deep metaphysical, ontological, theological significance of the thing for our salvation. And I think it has more to do with, this is a way of seeing whose side you're on. It's the litmus test for the authority of the Pope. And that is actually a theological question, because St. Thomas Aquinas had to address this in the Summa Theologica. Does the Pope, independent of a council, have the authority to promulgate a creed? Can the Pope compose a, I believe that, and then impose that on the Catholic faithful? And the Orthodox position is no. The Pope can't do that on his own authority. And the Catholic position is, yes, he can. Yes, he can. Because Christ had said to Peter, thou art Peter, and I give to you the keys, and whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. And that's the position that Thomas takes. And in fact, we have popes that have done that. Paul VI actually promulgated the credo of the people of God. Here's what you have to believe. He laid it out there for us.
All right.
So Pope can do that. And because the Orthodox don't hold to that, they dispute that the Latin Church, in the person of the Pope, could promulgate this or make this kind of alteration to the creed without an ecumenical council. But sort of boiling down now to the theological issue, the internal life of the Blessed Trinity, Sacred Scripture says, Jesus says, when the Counselor comes, whom I shall send you from the Father. I shall send. Jesus says, I shall send. John 16, verse 7, nevertheless, I tell you the truth, it's to your advantage that I go away, for if I do not go away, the Counselor will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. I will send. Jesus will send. St. Paul says, Romans chapter 8, verse 9, anyone who doesn't have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. And 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 11 says, the prophets inquired what person or time was indicated by the Spirit of Christ within them when predicting the sufferings of Christ and his subsequent glory. So there's ample evidence in Scripture that the ministry of the Spirit comes to us from Christ. And so in being connected by the Spirit to Christ, we are connected to God, the second person of the Trinity, right? And there is the reason for articulating the doctrine is to underscore the full divinity of the Son.
Okay.
So there you go.
Barbara, thank you so much for your call. Appreciate hearing from you. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Got an email from Teresa. If an individual cannot be judged for their lack of exposure to Christianity, but rather on the level of what they know, isn't it better not to evangelize them for fear of condemning them if they reject Jesus?
Yes, I appreciate the question. Look, there's a thing called pseudoscience and quack medicine.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, if somebody is a practitioner of pseudoscience and quack medicine innocently, because they haven't been taught better, they practice folk medicine because it's what their great grandmother did, and they were raised out in the hinterlands, and they're not exposed to modern medicine, and they get sick, and they say, well, obviously what I need is a couple of duck feet and a pair of rubber boots, and a full moon, and some frog spawn, and I'll mush it around in a bucket and pour it over my left elbow while chanting, I don't know, the lineup of the Crimson Tide or something. Are they responsible for their ignorance? Would I judge them for their ignorance? No, of course I wouldn't judge them. I would pity them. Is it going to cure them? No, it's not. Might they get well anyway? Could they get over their ailment just because their immune system is strong? Yeah, they might still get well. But their particular intervention is actually not going to facilitate that process. Even though they're innocent of any wrongdoing, it's just not helpful to them. Now, if someone is ignorant, say, of the life of grace and the virtues and what human flourishing actually consists in, and instead they apply all kinds of superstitious remedies to their own moral and spiritual dilemma, are they responsible for their ignorance? No, they're not. But are their superstitions going to help them? No, they're not. And so I want to expose them to as much truth and light as I prudently can, because I'm actually trying to advance them, not just in abstract knowledge of Christian history, but in the life of faith and charity and the virtues. And so Christian formation is an important part of that. Now, I do think there is a case where a priest or an evangelist might make a prudent decision to move gradually for the reasons that you stated. I mean, I know of a case, I know of more than one case, but I have one very salient example in my mind of an individual who asked an evangelist, should I become Catholic? And the evangelist had strong reason to suspect that the person would not follow through positively if given an affirmative answer, but that an affirmative would, in fact, be the kind of stumbling block you are considering. And so the evangelist gave a kind of evocative and provocative answer, meant to spur thought, consideration of one's condition, the actual contents of one's conscience, rather than a simple yes or no. Now, I'm being very cryptic in this and not using any names and stuff because there are personal reasons for that.
Fine.
People involved might not want the story told, but I'm just thinking. So the goal is always to move the ball down the field.
Of course.
Like, how can I actually persuade this person, move this person to a life of greater faith and charity and virtue? And sometimes Jesus says, be as wise as a serpent, some cunning, some discretion, some patience. The church advocates the value of gradualism. You know, I may have to do some pre-evangelism before I can do outright evangelism. Very sensitive to the concern that you raised.
Sure. All right, very good. And thank you so much for that question. We do appreciate it. It's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. We do have a couple of lines open, and if you call right now, we can hopefully get you on today's program. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Faith now in Florida, listening on WPBV. Faith, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. Thanks for taking my call. I'm trying to understand the sacrament of baptism in the Catholic faith. I'm currently curious about the Catholic faith, and I've been dealing with some family tragedy, and I just wanted to know the answer to the difference of, or I guess the relationship between baptism of intent and baptism of desire. So if baptism of intent for parents of infants is a righteous I don't know the word.
Sacrilegious?
No, not sacrilegious, but it's real in the eyes of God when a parent of an infant baptizes their child. But if how does it translate for a baptism of desire for a child that didn't make it to their birthday? Died.
Sure. I really appreciate the question. So, of course, the position of the Catholic Church is that absence of water baptism does not guarantee damnation. The fact that someone does not make it to the baptismal font is not a guarantee that that person is lost. On the contrary, the presence of baptism is a guarantee of the presence of grace. Right? So if you receive a valid sacrament, you know with certainty that grace has been offered to you in a particularly efficacious way. The absence of the sacrament does not prove that no grace was offered. And in fact, the Church teaches dogmatically that God offers sufficient grace to every soul that they might be saved. I mean, that's the teaching of the Church, that every soul is offered the grace whereby they might be saved. Now, when it comes through baptism, through any of the sacraments, then we have a tangible, visible sign of that grace, and the fact that it's tangible, the fact that it's visible, makes it uniquely appropriate to our psychology. I mean, you can lay hold of a sacrament quite physically, quite truly, in a participatory, embodied, engaged manner that makes it quite actionable, and it's easy to see what needs to be done. You know, when I go to the sacrament of confession, it's very simple for me to know what I need to do. Enumerate my sins and say I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I lived someplace far from the Catholic sacraments, ignorant of the Catholic faith, the absence of the sacrament would not guarantee that I had no grace, but because it doesn't come to me packaged in this tangible way, in this sign, it is much less actionable for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is it that I actually need to do? I might not know. It might not be realizable to me, and the grace might go kind of unnoticed, if you will. So the sacraments sort of clarify and locate that grace in a profoundly actionable way for me. Now, in the case of the infant child, in the ancient church, well, I should say the medieval church, the view was God would never condemn these souls to hell because they have no actual sin. It's unthinkable that God would condemn them to hell because they have no actual sin. But, with a very strong insistence on the necessity of baptism, some theologians, Thomas Aquinas among them, said, yeah, but without that guarantee of sanctifying grace, we can't confess that they're in heaven, so there must be an intermediate stage, something intermediate between eternal glory and just, and punishment.
Okay.
So they imagined, and this is just an imagining, the doctrine of limbo, a place of natural happiness, like an eternity at a Caribbean golf resort or something, but short of the beatific vision. Now, modern Catholic theologians, including the popes, have more or less rejected the doctrine of limbo because it has no basis in Scripture or revelation, but they have approved the logic of it, which is that God would never condemn these poor souls to hell because they have no actual sin, no fault of their own. And God, of course, is both just and merciful, and that would be neither just nor merciful. And so I think the presumption of most Catholic theologians, without holding out that this has been divinely revealed. It hasn't been divinely revealed, but it's a logical inference from God's character and attributes that these children are given grace in an extraordinary manner, known only to God, and that we can hope in their salvation.
Well, we certainly hope that's helpful for you, Faith. Thank you so much for your phone call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have a wonderful program on EWTN television called Women of Grace with Johnette Williams. Well, guess what? We also have a wonderful radio show, totally different show on EWTN Radio, also called Women of Grace with Johnette Williams. And we bring that to you every Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern, with an encore during the overnight hours at 3 a.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Johnette shows you how to embrace the Catholic life with joy and peace. So if you haven't checked us out on the radio side, we certainly invite you to do that with Women of Grace with Johnette. It is a wonderful show. Back to the phones now. Here is Neil in Wilmington, North Carolina, listening on Wilmington Catholic Radio. Neil, what's on your mind today, sir?
Oh, hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Just really quick, I wanted to find out what were the main reasons for the great schism in the Catholic Church between Orthodox Christianity and the Roman Catholic Christianity. I've heard so many things, but I just don't know what was exactly the main reasons why we had this great schism so long ago. If you don't mind my asking, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
We actually talked about that earlier in the show.
Yeah, we sure did. So I appreciate the question. So from the beginning of the Christian faith, the apostles went out to the four corners of the world, preached the gospel, and the gospel took root, the church took root, the liturgy took root in different cultural, linguistic environments.
Mm-hmm.
And, as the church grew, traditions and embellishments around the sacred liturgy took different forms depending on language and culture and circumstance. And we could identify more or less several sort of distinct families of ancient Christianity according to those cultural differences. We now call them rites, R-I-T-E-S, rites. And they would be basically, say, the Coptic rite in Egypt, Alexandria, Ethiopian, Eritrean in East Africa, Syrian in, of course, Syria,
Mm-hmm.
then the Roman, of course, in the See of Rome. Also the Assyrian in Baghdad, and then Byzantine, what emerged out of Constantinople, and then and it traveled all the way over into India, and so sort of allied to the Assyrian, you would have the Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malankar over there. And so there were profound differences in these expressions of Christian faith, though they were basically united in their celebration of the sacraments and for a long while in their confession of God and Christ and the nature of the Blessed Trinity. They began to sort of pull apart in the 4th century over peculiarities in their Christology. So some of the Syrians, Armenians, and Coptics did not accept the Council of Chalcedon, which defined Christ as existing in two natures, divine and human. And so they sort of kind of went their own way, and they maintained, their same liturgical practice, but had a different Christology. In the Assyrian Church, the Nestorians, also in the 5th century, departed over the question of whether or not Mary was the mother of God. And so they proposed a Christology different yet again, far different from the Alexandrians, and sort of departed from Catholic consensus on the divine in nature and human nature in Christ. And so Latin and Greek churches basically maintained a unity of faith about the Trinity and Christ. But you could see, there were cracks beginning to emerge in the Christian world in the confession of faith, and so different groups began to kind of go their own way. But there was still a Catholic unity in the center, if you will. But East and West, Latin and Greek, developed different theological traditions, different ways of expressing the mystery of the faith, different liturgical traditions and spirituality. And today, from the point of view of the modern Catholic Church, all of these traditions are valuable. They have apostolic origins, and there are things in their spirituality and liturgy, and even in their theological traditions that are really open to the whole Catholic world, and they're a patrimony, a great reservoir, a treasury that we can avail ourselves of. And so those differences need not divide us, right? But nevertheless, they sometimes do. You say tomato, I say tomato, and we do that too long, and we're going to start fighting over vegetables.
Sure.
Right? And so the cultural differences definitely have an impact, had a major impact. And of course, Constantinople was profoundly wealthy, became the seat of the empire. That's where the power center was. And the West fell into, something of a decrepitude. And it was conquered, of course, by Visigoth and barbarians from the Greek point of view. And educational standards fell and monetary standards fell. And the West sort of collapsed into what we think of as the Dark Age or the Middle Ages, and there was a loss of economic vitality and academic research that wasn't fully recovered for centuries and centuries. And so from the Byzantine point of view, the Latin West basically turned into a bunch of rednecks, okay? And that played a major role because, the Pope in Rome claimed universal jurisdiction over the entire church, and he always had claimed that. And that claim became more and more unpalatable to the East as they began to see the West as, more and more a bunch of yahoos, right, who didn't know what they were doing. And there's some evidence for the redneckiness of the Latin Church, right? I mean, there were some serious gaffes, on the part of papal actors and some misjudgments about, definitely some failures in diplomacy, I mean, kind of putting your feet up on the other guy's desk and picking your teeth kind of thing. Some real missteps in the way we interact. And so you can see, these sort of highfalutin, highly educated, sophisticated folks in the East growing more and more impatient with the roughnecks that were running around in the Latin West. And then, of course, one of the chief roughnecks, a fellow by the name of Charlemagne, had himself declared Roman emperor, and the Pope goes along with this in the year 800, the coronation of Charlemagne. Well, you can imagine that the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople did not take kindly to that at all. I mean, that was a major affront. And of course, the Carolingian Church made innovations in liturgy and in the sort of style of Catholic life and spirituality. And from the Eastern point of view, the greatest affront of all, we mentioned this earlier in the show, was the introduction of the Filioque clause in the Creed, which, not so much in my judgment as a matter of theology, but rather the impudence, as the East would see it, of you guys running off and doing this on your own, on the authority of the Pope, without the East having a say-so in how we articulate the Common Creed. But it didn't lead to a schism between East and West until the political forces began to really heat up, and various patriarchs in Constantinople really wanted to stop being under the jurisdiction of the Pope, and so they started casting around for reasons to reject papal primacy, and things like the Filioque clause emerged as, here's a good reason to reject the papacy. But I think it's best explained really by the divergent sort of cultural, theological traditions that created gradual animosity between traditions. And the final coup de grace, if you will, was the Fourth Crusade, which happened at the beginning of the 13th century when Latin crusaders sacked Constantinople and attempted to impose a Latin patriarch. That was sort of the final straw for the East. I mean,
all right, very good. And Neil, thanks so much for your call. We have just enough time for Mark in Austin, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Mark, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yeah, good afternoon. Came back to the church recently, going through an annulment, and one very painful, by the way. And two questions on that. Number one, do the people on the annulment committee understand, from a canon law and legal perspective, that there's also a psychological and emotional issue with taking people back through very painful moments and, potentially reliving PTSD? That's my first question.
We're almost out of time.
I better jump on the first question.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. They certainly do understand that. And if you have been through that experience and it's been traumatic for you, I am very, very sorry. I mean, really deeply sorry.
Yeah.
And my experience with members of the tribunal is they're trying to do the best they can. Most of them are. And they take an oath before God not to lie.
Mm-hmm.
And because the proceedings are meant to be a fact-finding, a truth-finding operation, truth-telling is very important to that. And so, yes, there needs to be a pastoral concern for the people who are going through this, but that pastoral concern should not obviate the necessity of truth-telling.
Okay. Did you have something else, Mark, for us?
Yes, I did. Real quickly, now that I've been going back to confession, and I read Padre Pio's quote on this, was very telling to me about remind Satan of his future when he reminds you of your past. One of the things I understand, I want to get clarity on, is I go to confession, I confess all my sins, known and unknown, and I'm continued to be reminded of sins that happened 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Okay.
My question is, how do I know when my sins are truly forgiven?
Yeah, I got that. I got you. When the priest says, I absolve you of your sins in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, that's how you know.
Boom.
That's how you know. It's not memory, not trauma, not pain, not sorrow, not emotional response. None of those things are of any, they have no indicating value to the status of your absolution. It is the authority of the church given to it by Christ that gives you the certainty of your forgiveness.
And if I may add, what a gift it is.
What a gift it is.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much for your call. I'm glad we could get it in there at the end of the show. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
We do this program on EWTN Radio 5 days a week, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. You can check out the podcast, as we mentioned earlier, anytime you wish at EWTNradio.net, EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our fantastic team here, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. We will see you next time on EWTN's Call to Communion. Looking forward to it. God bless.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show.
We'll celebrate the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul with Dr. Marcellino D'Ambrosio, a.k.a. Dr. Italy. We'll also catch up with canon lawyer Father Philip Michael Tangora and share more